Chapter 4. Benita's reception, 11 o'clock. Lunch with Angelica was the plan, though I was having second thoughts. Lately, she'd been hinting that she wasn't entirely enthusiastic about our meetings. Still, how could anyone resist the sunshine from Bahia? With her dark tan against the whitest teeth I'd ever seen, and laughter like champagne, she had a way of lighting up even the darkest day. So, yeah, I was probably going to keep turning up uninvited. When I arrived, I saw her through a side window by the entrance. Hidden behind the counter and no guests in sight, she took the opportunity to file her nails while chatting away on a headset. It took 2 heavy knocks on the window before she noticed me. I held up the lunch boxes signed by Antoine and Pierre to show I wasn't coming empty-handed. It took her a moment, figuring out how to react, but no one can resist Benita's star chefs. She rolled her eyes and waved me in. As I rounded the building and stepped through the main entrance, the vast expanse of the lobby struck me anew. So much wasted space. If you removed the plush sofas and some of the larger palm trees, the whole place could easily be transformed into a soccer arena. The reception was directly to the left, where her steady eyes followed me. I waved tentatively. "We don't want you to starve," I said. She smiled and shook her head.
"Thanks a bunch, dear. I'll be fat as a pig with the food around here."
I gave her perfect body a quick once-over and managed a skeptical smile. "You don't exactly look like you're about to balloon anytime soon." We savored our meal in a quiet spot behind a screen, close to the reception desk. She took a few bites, testing the culinary creation's quality, and gave a soft, of approval. Halfway through, she gently placed down her utensils and slid the chair back. With a neutral look, she asked the question that had likely been on her mind for some time.
"Do you fancy me, John?"
I let it hang in the air. The signal she sent out told me it was time to weigh the words carefully. Yes and no. On one hand, you're incredibly beautiful, and you'd have to be blind not to see that. On the other hand, I've heard you're seeing someone. So, I think it's best if we stay friends. She looked so relieved that she might as well have stabbed me in the heart. Francisco, the boyfriend, was one lucky bastard. That was for sure. After the meal, I lingered outside the reception. I had half a mind to head home for a nap. But duty called. The discovery under Archie's bed had brought implications. I probably should check his bungalow daily, and other places as well, such as the shared office and the tennis hall. Finally, the sense of duty won out. My nap would have to be postponed. From the main building, a maze of paved walkways led to various facilities around the resort. Once we had discussed the mental state of Benitez's architect. Perhaps not entirely insane, but a certain degree of mental instability was likely present. Obviously, he had made it his life mission to defy the rule that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. The walkways were laid out in a totally random pattern, interrupted here and there by on and off ramps that led nowhere. To reach the tennis courts, I had to detour around the pool area and zigzag my way through sunbathing guests. At the office, I didn't even know where to start. There are so many hiding spots where someone crafty can stash a small bag. The task started to feel overwhelming, and after a hasty search that lasted no more than 5 minutes, I called it quits. This wasn't working. Any approach that had me doing daily searches through every nook and cranny of Benita was doomed to fail. I couldn't tiptoe around anymore. Archie and I needed to have a serious talk, and the sooner the better. Shortly before 1 o'clock, I was on track 5 and ready for my next lesson. Mrs. B had not yet turned up, so I tossed the bag onto a bench and sat down. It was an unwritten rule that we should always arrive early so the precious guests wouldn't have to wait. Perhaps their heads would explode if it ever came to that. Usually I didn't care, but for this particular lesson, I wanted to be on time. During my stay at Benita, I had learned a thing or two about the wealthy. There were different sorts, but basically, they all ended up somewhere on a scale of nastiness. The more money, the more they became utter bastards. Those with small fortunes never talked about money because they needed to show it didn't matter. In contrast, the super-rich had no problem complaining loudly about one cost or another, because money had simply stopped playing a part in their lives. Among all these rich people, I had not formed friendships with many. But there were exceptions. Mary Beresford, soon about to receive a lesson in the noble art of serving a winning first serve, was one of them. Father and daughter Beresford had been coming for a couple of years, but this was the first time Mrs. Beresford graced us with her presence. Mary, or Mrs. B, as I called her, was in her 60s and one of the most pleasant acquaintances I had ever made. A genuinely kind person, completely free of the diva-like behaviors her daughter exhibited to such an extent. Perhaps that's just how it goes sometimes. Nice skips a generation. I checked the phone and noted that she was running late. Scrolling through, I found my mailbox pretty empty. The last email was from 4 days ago. A childhood friend from Sweden was flying over and wanted advice on Brazilian attractions. I had responded with a lengthy email, complete with links to various sites. Meeting up would be fun, but it seemed less and less probable. The girlfriend had a real thing for shopping, and their tight schedule could complicate things. Finishing the email check, I noticed a message in the spam folder. Invitation to the hottest party in Rio was the subject line, sent from Vicky at commail17.com. After opening it, I doubted that Vicky was the sender's real name. More likely, this was from a sleazy guy with greasy hair in a basement somewhere. There were lots of pictures featuring young women in provocative poses. I found myself staring at one girl in particular. Her head was tilted slightly to the right, and the smile didn't look fake at all. She appeared genuinely sincere, young, innocent, and honest. All the things a prospecting male could ever wish for. She stared into the camera, and for a split second, it felt like we connected. According to the caption, the name of this beautiful woman was Lonnie. My eyes drifted to the next one. Beatricia wasn't as stunning, but she had a magnificent pair of breasts that really stood out. Upon closer inspection, I had to revise the first impression. Perhaps not as pretty as Lonnie, but there was that certain special something there, a presence that just oozed sex. She would probably be an amazing bed partner, if only I could pull out my credit card. While scanning through the rest, one thing was clear. All girls were so incredibly beautiful. That's what made it so hard to understand. What disaster would have to happen for a woman with those looks to end up on a porn site? A cheap internet brothel where you could gain access to Lonnie and her sisters for the price of a cup of coffee, and for a few extra coins, she could allegedly perform acts that nice girls shouldn't do on the first date. The sound of approaching steps interrupted my scientific study of naked female bodies. I turned off the phone and made sure the screen was black. Mrs. B had arrived, her hands gesturing apologetically.
I'm terribly sorry, John. The darn book had me completely forgetting the time.
I stood up. Absolutely no problem. After a quick double check that no explicit content lingered, I held up the phone. Besides, with this, one is never bored.
That's kind of you.
What book is it? Sounds interesting.
What? No, you wouldn't know it. It's what they call smut for old ladies, I think. But geez, it's mesmerizing.
Mrs. B directed her attention to the court.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this all day. After last time, it felt like I was in the zone, like you showed me.
She took a few swings before gently placing a hand on my forearm.
I'm making progress, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, Mrs. B. Giving her a quick nod, I met her eyes briefly. Full disclosure, your ability is impressive, especially for someone your age. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of irritation.
Thanks for the reminder.
Her tone was razor sharp, and I deeply regretted the clumsy words. I apologize 1,000 times, Mrs. B. I don't know what came over me. I am sincerely sorry. Can you forgive me? She let me stew for a moment before chuckling and slapping my arm.
Relax, John. I'm just messing with you.
It took me a second to catch on. Not entirely convinced, I fell into her laughter. Oh, good one. Eager to get going, I extended a racket. Instead of taking it, she sat down on the bench and gestured for me to join.
There's something I'd like to ask you. A private matter, really.
Sure, I'd be happy to. But remember, I'm just the tennis coach.
Oh, I don't know about that. I'm pretty certain you can provide me with some good advice.
Her gaze turned downward as she thought about how to put it.
I have a maid at home who
She hesitated, nervously rubbing her thumbs.
I think Maria is stealing from me.
She averted her gaze, as though accusing someone from the lower castes was taboo. Why do you think that?
Oh, it's a bit of this and that. Some jewelry disappeared. Nothing expensive. I mean, not for me. For her, it's probably a fortune.
Yeah, well, if you don't catch her red-handed, it can of course be difficult to prove anything. She nodded.
Indeed. But there's something else, too. We've always had such a good relationship, and now she's acting differently. And she hardly ever smiles. It's almost as if she's...
Guilty? Mrs. B took a moment to survey the surroundings before declaring verdict on the poor cleaning woman.
Yes, that's probably it.
How long has she been with you?
Well, that's what makes it all so difficult, too. It's been 4 years now, and in a way, she's almost a family member.
Sure. A family member who polishes the silver and vacuums your 300 rooms back in Fairfax, Virginia.
Maria is a single mother with a little daughter, and they are struggling. To make matters worse, her mother became ill last fall. Unfortunately, there is no health insurance.
Yeah, you could have given her a raise. Ever think about that?
Indeed, we did live in very separate worlds. From what I knew, Mrs. B came from humble beginnings, but a life of luxury was throwing off her internal compass. Two things mattered now: what any decent human being should have done and what I would actually say. I just needed to keep my tongue in check. Unfortunately, you have to fire her. As you said, the economic value doesn't matter much, but something else is also gone. Your trust. If you want, you can of course involve the police, but I guess you're not trying to get her arrested. She shook her head.
No police. It's not that.
Her hand returned to my arm.
Thank you, John. I didn't want to burden you with this, but it's been weighing on me, and you happen to be closest.
I nodded, about to speak, but she cut me off.
Of course, you're right. She must go, but I'll make sure it happens smoothly.
We sat in silence for a while. I gave her a sideways glance. She was lost in thought. The clock on the wall showed 1:15. We should get going, otherwise there would be no tennis. I leaned forward to stand, but only made it halfway.
John, there's one more thing.
She looked intensely at me. That kind of look you get when it's serious. Maybe the story about Maria had been about something else. A test of sorts, to see if she could move on to the main matter. Mrs. B, as I said, I'd be more than willing to assist. I just don't know what I can.
But you can, John. It's just that I don't know how to say this.
Fumbling for words, she nervously ran her hands up and down along the legs.
Regardless of whether you help me or not, I need your word that this conversation stays between you and me.
I paused for a couple of seconds, so she would know I wasn't the type to give out my word left and right. If you want my word, you got it. I don't make a habit of sharing secrets.
Okay.
She took a deep breath and locked eyes.
I want you to search my daughter's bungalow. We think she may be using drugs.
The surprise on my face must have looked funny, because she broke out in a smile.
Yes. So, it's just a suspicion, but I would...
She interrupted herself when I demonstratively shook my head.
John, you don't have to answer right away. But could you at least think about it?
I have to decline. This is so not my thing. If you have a problem of this kind with your daughter, I suggest you search the bungalow yourself. That little salvo made her come to a screeching halt. A moment later, she nodded thoughtfully.
Yes, you're probably right.
Is there anything specific that has happened?
No, not directly. But she's been acting strange. There are also rumors that some of the guests here at Bonita have had drug parties.
Suddenly, I was very curious to ask her what one did at a drug party, but held back. Rumors, Mrs. B. I think we're pretty far from anything like that here at Bonita. Melinda Worth would never allow it.
Of course, you're right. Silly me. I'm being a mother hen.
I shook my head. That's not silly. A parent who cares about her child. Nothing strange about that. What do you say? Shall we hit some balls now? She nodded and stood up. When I reached for my racket, she sat down again.
But I'm really worried, John. There was an occasion a week ago when I overheard her and a friend.
I put the racket back and waited for the rest.
Even though Susan is my daughter, I don't have the full picture. As a parent, you want to know exactly what your child is doing, but they grow up and you become separated. Boundaries are put in place. Boundaries that should never be crossed. But at this point, I'm really concerned. So I have to step over this line. Which I don't want to.
For the love of God.
Was it tattooed on my forehead? Burglar for hire, discount this week, 2 for the price of 1. I really apologize, Mrs. B. This is something I cannot do. As I said, I think you should have a conversation with your daughter. It's probably the best. I scooped up the balls and racket, zipping my bag closed. Perhaps we should give today's lesson a miss. Neither of us seemed to be in the mood. I grabbed the bag and offered a consoling pat on her shoulder. It'll be all right. You'll see. Her tearful eyes met mine.
John, please forgive me.
I shook my head. Nothing to forgive. You're worried about your daughter, that's all. She covered her face and began to cry. A discreet, soft cry, barely audible. Dignified somehow. I looked away and felt pretty useless. A quick glance around the area showed we were alone. I sat down and put a comforting arm around her. I shouldn't have. I really, really shouldn't have done that. The discreet crying turned into loud sobbing.
Oh, I'm just a big stupid goose.
She shook with emotion as tears rolled down the cheeks. I let go of her and gave the surroundings another look. Thankfully, no one else was around. For any passers-by, we probably looked pretty odd, like the older woman had just been rejected by her younger lover, or something like that. As I said,
John, I feel awful. You can't even imagine. I lied to you. Everything I said was just a big lie. I'm so ashamed that I tried to deceive a fine young man like you.
With a heavy sigh, she faced me. The mascara had not withstood the tears. Black streaks along the cheeks had transformed her beautiful features into a messy battlefield. No, you didn't try to deceive me. It's all right. She paused between 2 sobs. A trickle of snot dangled from the nose and swayed uncertainly on its way to the ground. She blinked twice, and then broke down again.
No, it's not. The story about Maria was just made up to...
Without any warning, she flew into my arms, crying loudly with her cheek against my chest. I hugged her awkwardly. She said something more, but I couldn't hear with her mouth pressed into my shirt.
Has been under so much pressure. Just want Susan to be safe.
In that moment, I understood just how deep a mother's love runs. Mrs. B was also a victim here. It had cost her dearly to admit the lie about Maria, and that's precisely why I decided to do what she asked.